Hello, I'm Tiger Slash Second here today with my main man Sal,
What's going on?
and today we're going to be talking about a subject that hopefully won't be obsolete within the next 4 weeks, unlike the majority of my videos, and that is GTs, Grand Tournaments in Warhammer 40,000, something both of us are pretty familiar with. So Sal, you're the one who got me into Warhammer to begin with. When did you start attending Warhammer GTs?
Well, let's see. I started playing 40K back in the early 2000s and didn't really attend any tournaments at the time. I fell out of the hobby for a couple years, and I got back into the hobby in 2014. So probably 2015, I started attending little local tournaments, like just low key stuff. Definitely not GTs, but
What people would call Rogue Trader tournaments, the RTTs.
yeah. So my first GT, I think, was in 2016. It was Hammer in the New Year down in Virginia.
Now, what would you
So
say the distinction is between the two?
it's mostly scale. Um, in RTTs, it's a single day. It's pretty much universally 3 rounds because that's the most you can reasonably fit into a day. GTs are typically a 2 day event, sometimes three,
Mm-hmm.
with a proportionately higher number of players and higher number of rounds. Usually 5 or 6 is most common. And the requirements for your army tend to be a little bit more stringent at an RTC. You can kind of usually get away with unpainted models and stuff like that. But at a GT, there's usually painting and basing requirements. And the level of competition at a GT tends to be higher because as if they're a bigger event, they tend to draw people from further away, which increases the likelihood you're going to run into a serious contender.
Now, that also, like you said, it increases the likelihood. In our particular cases, me currently residing in Virginia and you in the southeastern Pennsylvania area, we have some pretty heavy hitters in our local metas right in our backyard.
Yeah, for sure. Philly doesn't have the really serious scene that it once had, but it's kind of redeveloping, and the New Jersey area has a lot of serious players. Um, there's really
Certainly
been a
within driving
renaissance of
distance.
yeah, for sure.
I know around my area, um, the tournaments that take place just 2 hours north of here, and even the ones my local shop generates, we get some pretty serious people as well. Even some people whose names have been on the GT top eights, such as the Nova GT.
Yeah, for sure. There's a down where you are. There's a lot of really serious contenders down around the Virginia area.
Yeah, I think that has for the most part shaped my outlook on Warhammer. I remember getting into it around 2014, and my third game was it was in a Rogue Trader tournament happening at my local shop, and it ended up bringing some of those really high caliber players, and I was just going in there with 1,850 points to cobbled together Dark Eldar in 7th edition. But that's how I learned to play was thinking along those lines and just sort of figuring out the tips and tricks of the game. And I think when it comes to competitive play and when it comes to attending these kind of GTs in particular, that's sort of the mentality you have to go in there with. I know a lot of people, they at least from my experience, what I've seen is they'll try a tournament out. Like I got my buddy down here to try a tournament out once in a doubles match, just for funsies. And they go in expecting like the same kind of relaxing, I wouldn't say that GTs are unfun, but there's a stiff competition sometimes.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Uh, I think I think for a lot of people in a lot of areas, an RTT is their concept of serious competition. So a lot of people, that's the only kind of tournament that they go to. So they have their 2,000 points of Imperial Guard or Black Templars or whatever, and they're kind of hot shit in their local area, and they go to their RTTs. It's mostly their local friends, and they kind of have their own little internal uh, metagame, as it were.
Right. It's sort
And
of they're playing the same people they would normally play, but they're bringing their most what they consider to be their most broken lists.
right, and typically, uh, if they do make it to a GT, they realize the level of rigor is quite a bit higher, and a lot of times they're not only does their play and their lists not quite stack up, but it's like you said, things are taken a lot more seriously compared to the small scale hobby shop events.
Right. And but when I'd say they're taken more seriously, I don't mean that in the sense that people like it's not lighthearted. There is a lot of camaraderie when it comes to the GTs, but when it comes to army optimization, when it comes to reading the rules line by line, when it comes to knowing things about the game inside and out, that might get swept under the rug or just sort of, hand waved away during an RTT. That stuff comes up at the table of a GT sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. People are not shy about playing things you know exactly right, and making a point about stuff that at an RTT people would let fly. And I've seen people, kind of the local hero sort of person, uh, get pretty bent out of shape about an opponent that wanted to play things by the book.
Yeah. I've seen some of that, and I myself, being a good sport, have ended up getting roundly trounced by people I should have by all means beaten because of not adhering to the rules as by the book and letting them get away with a little too much. Some of the more unscrupulous people that will go to these events, by and large, the fewest in number, but unfortunately they do make their rounds occasionally. We'll take advantage of a nice opponent.
Yeah, for sure. It's unfortunate, and thankfully it's not super common. But yeah, there are definitely people that will take advantage of the situation. A lot of people, I think, um, are inherently pretty trusting, and a lot of people, I think, also are willing to kind of like let things go in the name of keeping things moving. And there's a lot of people that just from what I see mostly from looking at people the way they talk online, a lot of people seem to have sort of the taboo for themselves against questioning their opponent and their opponent's rules, which I always thought was a kind of an odd instinct.
Nick Brown brought something like that up in his preparing for a GT blog post about how it's okay to stand up for yourself at the table, say, hey, I'm not familiar with that rule. Could you show it to me in the book? I mean, it just has to be something as simple as that, and you can clear something up that maybe you're questioning, or maybe you might know that that rule works differently, and you just want a casual way of bringing it to their attention.
Yeah, yeah, it definitely can be a little bit of a skill to do that in a diplomatic way, but it's something that I don't think people should be afraid of. But for whatever the reason, they do seem to have a little bit of a hesitance.
Right, and as I recall, you've had a little bit of experience doing some event judging. Is that correct?
Yeah, I've judged some pretty big events, and it's something that I enjoy doing, and I put a lot of time to really thoroughly understanding the rules.
So, between both of our experience of attending and of course your experience as a judge and working with event organizers, what would you say for someone going to a GT? This is going to be their first GT. They've never been to one before. What would you say is the number one thing that they can do as a player and as an attendee to make things run as smoothly as possible?
I think the number one thing that they can do is know their own army material, whatever codex and book that they've got. So they're, the codex, Forge World supplements, their rule book. They should know that inside and out. They should be able to pretty much quote chapter and verse out of the whole book. Um, and not every detail of the rule book, but their codex, for sure. They should know pretty much unerringly what their book says. Because if you have to go back and forth to the rule book all the time, to check stuff, you're slowing down the game for yourself, and you're creating friction, and you're going to have a harder time catching when something is amiss. Because you're going to be, your head's going to be in your book when it should be staring at the table, and you're not going to be, you're not going to be as swift to catch misplays or incorrect rules interpretations that you would catch if you had if you really knew your material coming in.
Right, and that helps people not even, I mean, even ignoring the fact that you could be playing against someone, because they're very rare, the people that will try to pull one on you. But really, even when you're playing like the most honest player in the world, just having your rules already known, you're not checking your book during your opponent's turn or anything like that, you're able to sort of see as they're taking their turn what your turn is going to turn into. So you don't need to stand there thinking about your movement or your shooting phase. You've already got all that pretty much planned out from the time that it's your turn to start rolling the dice.
Yeah, for sure.
It really gives you that strategic advantage of being able to just look at your opponent's moves and know instinctually, okay, he's moving those Hive Guard over there. That means I'm going to be able to move this Star Weaver over here.
Yep, exactly. You're paying attention. You know what's going on. And you can kind of move things along.
And moving things along is unfortunately the biggest challenge at a large event. I mean, smaller events too, but in particular the ones where you're trying to orchestrate hundreds of games.
Yeah, absolutely.
What aside from the simple the gameplay mechanics such as knowing the rules, what as an attendee of the event do you think would be good from like from an attendance or a check-in or paperwork? What in specific is the one snag that always seems to be catching people at these events that could maybe they could work on to smooth things over?
Um, I think at bigger events, one of the ones that always shocks me is people don't. They'll show up to register and they won't have printouts of their army list, which is it's always very strange to me. That's like the number one thing that pretty much every event packet asks you to have. And in general, being prepared with everything that you might need to play the game is it's just good practice. You should have your rule books. You should have printouts of your list. You should have your dice. You should have your if you need cards for the game. Have a set of objective tokens because yes, the event might provide them, but they may not. Having pens and scratch papers that you can write down notes. Pretty much, be a Boy Scout. Bring in everything you might reasonably expect to need at some point. Don't expect it's going to be provided for you, and certainly don't expect you're going to have time to go hunting for it if you didn't bring it.
Like a Ziploc bag full of all the things you might need at the game table. It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. For a long time, I just brought a Ziploc bag with my dice and a legal pad and pens and a spare tape measure and all that sort of stuff in it.
Yes, having the spare tape measure, considering how frequently they tend to disappear, is really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely.
That sounds like some pretty good stuff for getting started at a GT. In particular, what is your favorite part about attending a GT?
So I think probably my favorite thing is the it's being around a lot of different hobbyists and seeing everybody's armies and getting involved in just kind of everything that's going on. There's people that are really into the hobby side and people that are really jazzed about the competition, and it's very very social. People people seem to think that tournaments are all about these whack assholes, and they're completely joyless and all this sort of stuff. But yeah, nothing could really be further from the truth. People go to these GTs, yeah, they want to go and they want to win, but they're going to hang out with friends and have a good time. And
Yeah, the best of times I've had at these GTs. I mean, um, in my personal experience, a Rogue Trader tournament less so, but a GT definitely. It's less an excuse to play Warhammer and more a sort of weekend party that just sort of has Warhammer as its central focus. During the boring daytime days, you play a few rounds of Warhammer with some people, and during the evening, well, it's just fun. It's just you hanging around at bars, listening to music. You're meeting all sorts of new people that you already share a common interest with.
yep, yeah, there's a lot of immediate sort of brotherhood. Everybody's usually drinking and playing their games, and yeah, sometimes people bent out of shape, but by and large, it's just an all around good time.
Yeah, unless someone gets bitten by a dog. Top tip: don't allow the other person to put an unpainted dog on the table.
Yep, no unpainted dogs.
So, of course, bringing this up at this current point, this is right now the tail end of May of 2018, and we have just seen the third, I believe it was the third London Grand Tournament. It was held last weekend.
Yeah, that's my understanding of that it's their third one,
There
which I
was
guess would be their second for eighth edition. It sounds like.
perhaps, well, not quite, I don't believe, because May last year was when the Gathering Storm was just finishing up.
Oh yeah, you're right. You're right. If it was at the same time last year, it would have been seventh edition.
Yeah. So, much bigger turnout this year, much bigger turnout. Had a few snags going along with that I wanted to sort of touch on. Now that we've mentioned GTs in general, some tips on attendance, what to expect, what to bring. What were your thoughts on the London GTs, just in general, Sal?
So I didn't have the pleasure of attending. So this is all sort of secondhand. But it seems like it was a very very ambitious attempt to scale up for the London GT team, and they advertised it as the I think the biggest 40K event in Europe, which it definitely was, and they had some problems related to their size and scale, and my understanding of the situation is that really Europe doesn't have a lot of, particularly London and I guess the rest of the UK at the very least, doesn't have a lot of really big venues like we do in the US, where we've got you can't walk a block without tripping over a convention center that can host 15,000 people. Um, and what venues and stuff that they do have are very expensive and not really designed for the kinds of events that that gamers want to run. So they hosted it, I guess, in the Olympic Stadium, which is pretty cool. But the venue wasn't really set up for the kind of thing that they wanted to do, and they had some problems, I guess, where the floor plans they were given weren't accurate.
From from
So
from what I've heard, the original plan was for about 250 attendees, but those tickets sold out in roughly a week, and there were so many complaints from potential customers that they decided to expand that number, which unfortunately led to some crowding issues.
yeah, that's what I've been led to understand. And obviously the venue kind of told them that they could support that. Seems like maybe it was still a little tight.
I've
Um,
been told that this is really the thing. Because we're stateside, this is all coming secondhand, but I know several people on the forums that I frequent, as well as Facebook groups that were over there. I've heard things about fire exits being blocked, about lines for security check-ins taking well over an hour, with only 15 minutes allotted at the times, just crowding issues in general, and lack of support for the additional people. It sounds like if it had stayed at about 250, it would have rolled a lot smoother.
yeah, I mean that's probably true. Smaller events are pretty much always easier to run. And my understanding is that unfortunately those issues that you described were did occur, but were largely to do with issues with the venue staff, not so much the tournament staff. Like
So this was the venue staff not being upfront with the limitations of the venue to the tournament organizers.
yeah, so like I was listening to an interview with Zach Becker, the guy that sort of is the face of the London GT, and he was talking about how like they give them they had floor plans they were given to set up their layout, and the fire exits weren't marked on it, and there were columns that took up a lot of space that weren't marked. So when they set up the first day, they were running into all these space constraints that weren't in the plans. So they had to spend a lot of time, I guess, during the lunch break, kind of unfucking their floor layout. And similarly, they being that it's big Olympic venue, it's very very important stadium. They wanted to bag check the massive amount of guys coming in with these big cases, and the staff or the venue staff only provided a couple bag checkers, which unfortunately then took an eternity. And obviously they knew how many people were coming, so it's not like they should have been caught off guard by that.
Yeah, from what I've heard, the bag checks were not very thorough. Numerous people, both on Facebook and on the forums, have indicated that one of the issues was there was not ample vendors for food or time allotted for lunch. So, and you were not allowed to bring outside food and water into the venue. However, most people, it seems, decided to challenge that, and everyone just kind of turned a blind eye to it as long as it was almost the movie theater philosophy of as long as you're trying to conceal it, no one's going to check you.
Yeah, I mean that doesn't surprise me.
So
It's
when
like
they,
any sports venue; they want to try and get you over a barrel and charge you, an arm and a leg for a glass of water.
right, but the overall point of the post was basically if they're not going to check the bags thoroughly enough to catch people bringing in outside food, what is the point of the bag checks at all?
Yeah,
Which I guess an easier way to do it might have been a randomized check, but I think that was probably a security measure put in place by the venue rather than actual event organizers.
oh yeah, 100%, 100%.
So,
No, no GT, no one who plays 40K thinks would think it would be productive to examine the bags of 400 Warhammer players.
very true. So the first topic that came up is obviously the most immediately comical is the terrain of the London GT, which, having played at Nova, I've seen some questionable terrain, but this did indeed seem to take the cake.
Yeah, I'm like legitimately not sure what happened there. It
Because
seems like they didn't.
as I was told, or as I heard, they began working on the terrain for something like 200 tables a week before the actual event took place.
I don't know what the timeline actually was. I want to give them the benefit of the doubt because that seems ludicrous. But but whatever it was, whatever the timeline actually was, it was not enough time. it's a massive undertaking to produce that much scenery, and I don't know what they had done for previous years, but I can't imagine any of the guys that were running it were any stranger to the expense and the time required to do that. So I'm not sure. Maybe it's just growing pains with the fact that they scaled up so much bigger than they were originally intending.
That yes, I have a feeling that so I've heard two contending theories on this. The first is that they're incompetent, but like you said, I genuinely don't think that's the issue, although I have heard that the previous two London GTs have had similar problems that weren't as egregious simply due to the smaller number of people. The other thing that I heard was that, oh darn it, I lost my train of thought. In regards to the terrain, they were trying to standardize the terrain, and this is a design philosophy which has been going back and forth through Warhammer competitive chains for quite a while now. Is standardizing the terrain layouts, standardizing what terrain is used on the tables. I know Nova is defined by the Nova L's. And I think the London GT was trying to go for something similar with their identical terrain layouts on every table.
Yeah, I looked at their packet like the week before the GT, and I was pretty impressed by what I saw. They had, plans for, a set of three different sets of terrain: a light, medium, and heavy terrain tables, and I think for 8th edition, it's really important that we have this line of sight blocking terrain, and that's clearly how they felt, and they were trying to provide that in a very consistent way. Provide a kind of unified competitive kind of format. So they accomplished that mostly. They had pretty much all uniform terrain. Apparently, they had some issues logistically that resulted in them only having enough to do, I guess, the medium level terrain across the board. But they did provide at least consistent, even if it wasn't quality terrain. So they achieved the competitive goal that they were aiming for.
Right, and if I could insert a little digression, this conversation about consistent terrain across the entire tournament. That's been brought up in numerous circles. I'd like to hear your thoughts on it.
What's that about? Consistent terrain specifically?
About having consistent terrain across all the tables of a competitive venue.
Uh, it's one of a number of different choices that an event organizer kind of has to make about their format. I think it's frequently a good thing to have. I don't think every tournament necessarily requires that, but I think it's generally a good idea. Otherwise, you can wind up with situations where somebody's playing on a table with barely anything next to somebody else playing on a table that's loaded to the gills, and that the way that the terrain is laid out can really favor or disadvantage an army. And if it's just sort of luck of the draw, what you get placed on, and you get a bad matchup on a bad board. That's a really unfun way to get knocked out of an event. So I think unless you're aiming for a particular effect with the way that you're providing your boards, aiming for consistency is a good idea to just avoid that problem.
I'm actually of the exact opposite school of thought because when it comes to having a consistent game board every single game, then you can tailor your army or tailor your list to that board specifically. Whereas if you had a wide variety of different boards that you could be playing on, it would be more beneficial to tailor it to like an all comers, or you don't quite know what you're going up against. It seems to me if you had a lot more games on a lot more different types of tables, it would force the player to have to actually play the game as opposed to simply playing an army list. A good example is the Nova Elves. Anybody going to Nova is going to be planning around having two large line of sight blocking pieces of terrain right smack dab in the middle of the board. That is every single board in the entire tournament, every single game. Um, that could be good, but every single army list that's being constructed is going to have that in it. So any army list that you see come out of the Nova GT that seems to be doing well has to have the asterisk next to it that this army list might only perform if it has two large pieces of line of sight blocking terrain right smack dab in the middle of the board. If it was like a very cluttered cityscape, it would probably behave very differently. If it was wide open, it would probably behave very differently. And I think having that variety of boards, having that variety of play, it sort of makes or breaks the general and how they adapt to different play styles.
So you're absolutely right that like a list that a competent general is going to take to Nova, for instance, is going to take into consideration the L's and more broadly that people write lists to be good at the missions and the format of the event that they're going to. So people take different missions to Nova that they take to ITC events, that they take to Adepticon, because the missions demand different things. Not just the terrain. But yeah, I mean that's very correct. But at the same time, if if you don't know what in an event where you don't know what kind of terrain you're going to be dealing with, that rather than I think rather than encouraging or discouraging like kind of take all comers lists, it really just encourages taking lists that don't care about the terrain whatsoever. Like for instance at Adepticon, one of the reasons Flyrants did so great at Adepticon was that they didn't care about the terrain one way or the other, what was going on. They could set up the table in such a way that because Adepticon has player-placed terrain, so the Tyranid player could go, well, I'm going to put all the ruins off to the sides of the table, get everything out of the way, make the board nice and open, and just swoop around, and you can't do anything about it. So, lists like that just don't care have a big advantage in scenarios where there's a lot of variation in terrain quality.
Well, you say that, but it takes two to tango. Certainly the other person on the other side of the board is looking at this, and if they have any kind of tactical ingenuity, they're going to realize, hey, this Flyrant player wants a big open board. I'm going to do the best of my ability to prevent that. And so if both players are of equal skill in the strategy of setting the board up, similar to how you might be of different skills in strategy of setting up the objectives, which we could say is also, well, not the same as terrain, in the same ballpark. Obviously, you can set up objectives even without knowing what side of the board you're going to be on in a way that would favor your army or wouldn't. Well, if both players are setting up the terrain in a way that would favor their army, chances are good at the end of the terrain setup, it's going to come out about even, because both players are going to be pulling as much towards their favored setup as possible.
I disagree, but I think it's it's a digression. We don't need to necessarily follow along anymore. We kind of go around about terrain placement strategy. Player placed versus fixed.
Yeah, that
forever.
That would be a long winding road. But as for the rest of the London GT, I've heard some people, like, there have been a lot of accusations thrown around, and obviously with every round it just plays a game of telephone until you end up with a purple monkey dishwasher. So people have been saying that they're too greedy in terms of money, but I honestly don't think anyone in the history of the game has ever thrown a GT to make money.
Yeah, no, the running events is there. It's not a money making proposition at all.
I'm
It's phenomenally expensive to run that stuff.
like, God bless the Nova Open. I'm not sure how they managed to make it work, but all of their proceeds go to charity. Um, but yeah, I don't see the London GT, especially considering the turnout that they had compared to the venue that they were renting, making really. I would be surprised if they actually operated in the black.
Yeah, that I would be shocked as well. Like their venue that they had to rent, again, considering the constraints that they have and where they were, the rent on that place was mind-bogglingly expensive. And
I think that's one thing that most people don't understand because a lot of the figures that I've seen rolling around are roughly analogous to what a convention center might be rented in the States for a similar price, but converted into pounds. And I don't think people realize that this isn't like a 5,000 pound venue. This is like a 20,000 pound venue.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
I do think this was brought up on the Dark City that they were greedy in a different sense. I believe the wings of Icarus were brought up at one point in a Facebook group, but basically they reached a little too high and ended up falling for it by trying to get as many players as possible into their event without realizing that the support that they would require increases exponentially as the convention grows.
Yeah, I mean, hard to fault them for trying to accommodate the demand, but you know, growing pains, I guess.
That's true. Unfortunately, because of the just, I mean, I'm already seeing the memes coming out of this. Um, of course, there's one elephant in the room that we'll get to in a minute, but I have a feeling that the roster for the fourth London GT will not be quite as large.
Yeah, one way or the other, it'll probably be a little bit smaller. Hopefully, be for the reason that they deliberately cut it down and not due to backlash, because it's unfortunate. They obviously nobody sets out to do a bad job. You
Obviously,
know,
yeah. No one really got into this to try and no one went into this thinking, okay, let's fuck up the London GT. But um, just I think that if they had sat down and seriously considered the amount of support, not just from the venue in terms of the size, but also in terms of the food and the time constraints and what it would be like trying to bag check that many people, which I can only assume that they would know have to be done. Like, from what I was told, they only allowed 15 minutes for a bag check of something like 400 or 500 people.
yeah,
That is not
I
within the realm of any sober thought processes.
yeah, I don't want to speculate too much on what their what their behind the scenes stuff was. I have no way of knowing, and again, like I said, I'm sure they had the best of intentions and did their best, but I guess better luck to next year, and I'm
Uh,
sure they've learned a lot and will continue to learn a lot from the sort of post mortem.
I really do genuinely hope that the staff behind the LGT um are I really like need to say humble enough to sort of accept that this year could have been a lot better. There were some things that were beyond their control, but there's a lot of things that they could have handled differently and actually sit down and think through how they're going to overcome these challenges next year because I do want them to succeed and it would be really nice if the LGT was a great reason to take a London vacation. Um, But from the sounds of it, most people that did travel for this event ended up coming away disappointed.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but I have pretty much absolute faith in their ability to learn from mistakes. They're smart people, um, and I think they'll do better next year. I wouldn't be shocked if they have the nicest terrain of any event next year after what happened this year.
I have a feeling Games Workshop will help them a great deal with that, considering they're right in their backyard.
Yeah, one can hope.
So, of course, the elephant in the room that I haven't brought up yet, and this touches on a larger subject, which I know has been um, a personal thing that has stuck in your craw in the past, is the alleged cheating of Alex Harrison in his streamed game against Jeff Robinson. So, Sal, why don't you give me your take on that?
I think this is it's a really weird case. It's particularly surprising. Well, I guess all right. So context. Um, there was I guess some shady behavior in the stream of the final invitational game between Alex Harrison and Jeff Robinson. Now Jeff won the game, and I guess on the Twitch stream, chat was going nuts in the way that chat pretty much universally goes nuts
Yeah,
about.
Twitch stream chat is not so much a chat as it is just an endless stream of consciousness.
Yeah, and from a lot of streamed games that I've watched, it's obvious that Twitch chat loves to believe, whether it is or not, that cheating and misplays are going on. So that's the baseline expectation for Twitch chat, is they're going to be bitching about how people are playing.
Twitch plays Warhammer.
Anyhow, and I'm not sure what even called this to the attention of the judges, but after the fact, they reviewed Alex's game with Jeff, again, that he lost, and decided based on what they saw that they were going to ban him from future London GTs. And they posted all of this information in a very public fashion.
A very public and lambasting fashion.
Yeah, there was maybe a touch of emotion that didn't need to be in there. I'm not quite sure that was the best way to handle that. Frankly, I'm not sure quite what to make of this. My understanding is that Alex has, and I don't know Alex, but my understanding is he's got a little bit of a reputation. I watched the video, and some stuff seemed a little blatant. But other stuff could have been honest mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes while playing the game.
I'm willing to bet that if you were to take a similar stream of any given table during the third round of the day, you would find just as many rules discrepancies because people were tired and they're hungry.
1,000%, yeah. There's no doubt about that in my mind.
The difference is, and this is the thing that's constantly brought up, because it's the top table, people care. No one cares what's going on at table number 56.
Yeah. People playing out in the nosebleeds are playing wrong left and right, but nobody cares about that. So it always blows my mind the degree to which people are out for blood for the top tables, and those people are pretty much universally the armchair generals. They either didn't go to the event, or they were playing on table 3,000 with their 3 Baneblade list or whatever, and it's usually people that aren't close to the top end of competitive play that are complaining about this, and they complain that the judges don't do enough, and they complain that competitive players don't care, and all this stuff. None of which is the case.
Now, obviously, that's not the case, and I know that's why I opened this with this was a particular sticking point of yours was the handling of cheating in high-level play, particularly when it comes to GTs, has something. It's been something that's been brought up. It's been brought up numerous times. The one sticking point that comes to mind was the Nova Invitational of last year, where the last game was decided with a handshake, in part believed because it was going to be streamed, and one of the players had also an ill reputation.
So that's not quite the case. So what had happened was, um, PJ Pants had been playing this Charybdis Claw full of Corn Berserkers, but he hadn't matched up his Legion and his Mark of Chaos, and so on, and kind of had stuff in the wrong detachment. It wasn't legal to put the Berserkers in his Charybdis. He had played through the Invitational up to the end, pretty much with that. And it didn't get caught until he played through the GT. Then it got brought to the judge's attention, and they made it very clear to him he was going to have to play straight. He it was a mistake, whether honest or otherwise. It was a mistake, and he wasn't going to be permitted to continue to play that way, which sucks for him, But whatever. You can't put those troops in that transport. You can't do it. So to what extent that really changes the way his list works, who knows? It's not really material. But the morning of the final round of the Invitational, they rolled to seize. He's playing against Andrew Gagno, who had at the time a really great index guard list, and without the claw, PJ felt that he was going to get shot off the board and conceded based on that, and then they went and got breakfast. So I don't think it had anything to do with Jean Pants not wanting to get streamed, but I will say though that it's a rough deal playing on stream. It's not something I would be inclined to want to do.
Well, of course, but that's unfortunately sort of the hazard you open yourself up to once you reach those higher echelons of the game. When there's money on the table, or when there's where there's a reputation on the line within, a very particular circle, that tends to be what happens.
Yeah, and
not just being on stream, obviously, but also accusations, and you really have to be. Who was it that Tony was playing that was such an upright chap? Was that Alex Fennell?
Oh, yeah, Alex Fennell.
You have to be almost someone of his moral character to be able to survive under those kinds of conditions without any real criticism.
Yeah. And I've seen in the past Alex fuck up and basically concede a tournament and go home on the base of that. So there are people out there, and I think most serious 40K competitors are that kind of person. And there are some people that are shady, but the vast majority or people are up and up and they're honorable and they want to play right, because there's no prestige in cheating to win. You don't. That's a hollow victory.
Yeah, and I think that's something most people. You're not inclined to hear about the guy who ended up giving up because he realized, oh, I haven't been playing this army right the whole time. I'm just going to drop because I don't want there to be any kind of an argument about it. You're going to hear about the guy who tried to get away with it. Yeah,
and like you said, no people on table 3000 are not. They're not the people that are getting called on this stuff. It's people at the top end, and it's really interesting to me the lengths that the internet armchair generals will go to claim cheating is occurring, even so far as to on stream Nick Brown was actually playing against PJ Pants at Nova in a late round, and Nick had to look up a rule, and rather than looking it up on the spot, he just asked a judge, and the judge told him, and the internet became convinced that he was trying to cheat because he had to look up the rule in a rule book, which was really just bewildering. That's the that's the exact opposite of trying to cheat. Asking a judge how a rule works is the exact opposite.
Yeah. Well, even leaving the streams. I mean, the stream is obviously just like I said. It's a stream of consciousness. It's just not. It's mind numbing. But the way cheating has been handled in GTs in the past has been. I'm going to be frank here. From my perspective, it seems the way a GT is in the past been set up, if you're going in there and you know that you have a good shot of winning, or at least coming in the top 8, and you know your list is good, but you're going to help it any way you can, honestly, it seems like from the perspective of someone looking to weasel their way in there, most players are accommodating, and most judges, in my experience, have been afraid to put their foot down.
Well, people are definitely accommodating, and I think it's easy for somebody that's motivated to try and get away with stuff for the most part, at least through the first couple rounds. As soon as they run into somebody that's been playing 40K seriously long enough to have an inherent paranoia, that tends to get caught and dealt with. Maybe not the overall pattern, but it tends to go away for that game.
Right. But as I said, you have to sort of play against those particular players. And in 8th edition, and specifically in 8th edition, we're seeing a lot of new players and a lot of new armies entering into the top 8 or the top 16. Because of this, a lot of these people have not really encountered this kind of playstyle before. There's many different ways to try and cheat someone, at least that I've seen personally, and then what other people have told me. There's the fast dice, obviously, and the people that are that claim they know the rules but don't really, and then of course there's the ones that just try to, the very strong personalities that are trying to tell you almost how to play your army.
Yeah.
All different ways to do it. All depending on the person, different levels of effectiveness. But really, when it comes down to it, it's being able to call that as you see it, but also having the judges stand by you. Now, let's say that you have a relatively inexperienced GT player who's doing well. It's 8th edition, new codex is out, their army's doing well. They never thought they would get this far, and they're seeing someone trying to fast play them. Do you think the judges of most GTs, in your personal experience, would probably take a stand if they were called over, or do you think that would be something that they would how do you view general enforcement of the rules within GTs?
So the approach that most judges take are it's called vampire judging, basically, which is the judge is not going to intervene directly in the game unless they're invited to intervene in some way. The reason for that being there's very few qualified judges, so each event really is only going to have a handful of them. That means that they're all individually trying to cover a lot of tables. And unfortunately, they can't provide the degree of coverage that would be necessary for active judging. The reason being is, all right, sure, I can walk around and I can pay attention and ask and answer questions. And if I see something go wrong, I could step in and do something about it while I'm doing my patrol. But then I've intervened in this game, but I didn't intervene in another game. And maybe I intervened on one player's behalf, but not on the other. And if I catch one player's misplay and I fix it, and I don't catch somebody else's, that's a bad situation. I've kind of turned that game and the outcome of that game into my responsibility in a way that it really shouldn't be.
So what you're saying is the judges only intervene when they're specifically called.
That is typically how events run it, due to the fact that there's not a judge for every single table.
Right.
And yeah, so
So let me ask you this. Let's say you're coming up on table 10 out of in a top 16 that's table 10. There's some guy who's fresh face. He's never been in the top 16 before. He thinks his opponent's fast playing him. He's kind of nervous to say anything to a judge, but he kind of waves you over and mentions something, and the other guy is getting a little defensive. How would you handle a situation like that?
I mean, you get the story.
This is sort of judging 101, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, you get the story from both players. You listen to what they have to say, and then because you can't really ever retroactively do anything about a situation like that. You can't like go back in time and fix it. Mm-hmm. You didn't see it take place, whatever the infraction was. You didn't see it. The board might have changed. So in a situation where they feel like they're being bullied through the game.
So in a particular instance where they feel like they're being bullied in a game.
Yeah, so in that case, chances are I would hang out by that table for a while. I'm going to ask them what's going on, try and get the story, and then because that, being bullied or rushed or kind of buffaloed through a game is an ongoing pattern of behavior. That's one where I'll hang out and kind of witness what's going on there, because that's the only way it can be dealt with. They've given me a reason to intervene in that game.
Right, and this is an important point. Most cheating, in my experience, most cheating is, or at least can plausibly be chalked up to, simply not knowing the rules or being tired or not knowing something or forgetting something. Most of it is completely innocuous. There is the outlying, I'd say like 5% of those cases where it's intentional. And in those cases, I think most of it is not so much, like loaded dice or anything like, or rolling behind terrain or anything like that. I think most of it is psychological. It's trying to buffalo your opponent.
Yeah, people definitely do that. Like you said earlier, there's a lot of strong personalities, and if you are not also a strong personality and you don't have the sufficient level of paranoia, it's kind of easy to get walked on in a tournament.
Yes, I've had people try to do that to me, to varying levels of success. I will say that in retrospect, because of that, I am a much more, I wouldn't say paranoid player, but
Shrewd's maybe a better word.
I don't want to use the word asshole, but I will be a stickler if it's an event. If it's a friendly game, anything goes. But if there's, if it's a tournament, I'm going to call you on that over and over and over again. And yeah, honestly, I think a lot of players should do that.
Yeah, you got to be shrewd. You have to be willing to call people on stuff. I think the Buffalo sort of situation, it's more of a sportsmanship than any issue than anything else. But it is a kind of problem.
The sportsmanship in 40K is something that I'm not sure how this was in the past, because I haven't attended events prior to 2014. But it seems that, from what I've heard, from people who've gone to events, gone to tournaments, and similar things, narrative things, in the past, a lot of it has been based around not so much how well your army just wins at the game, usually by flexing rules or just being a better general or things like that, but it was a more holistic approach. What we might today call the Renaissance Man was actually the winner of whatever event happened to be going on, as opposed to there was the GT winner and Renaissance Man was like just a completely different category. And sportsmanship, I think, aligns with that, where it's not intrinsic to the hobby and it's not intrinsic to the game, but it's something that goes along with that sort of holistic mentality of this isn't like an e-sport or something. This is something different. This is something more personal.
Yeah, I mean it's very tough to use those things in scoring due to certain problems that soft scores have. But they are they are a way of dealing with some of those issues, and they're an important aspect of the game, the hobby aspect and the sportsmanship aspect. And there are still a lot of events. The London GT actually is one such event that treats their overall winner as the overall on score and paint sportsmanship. I mean, yes, they recognize their best general as well, but the guy that goes home with the big trophy is the Renaissance man, as it were.
Indeed. So, let me ask you, um, if there was one change that you could make to a GT format, or a Rogue Trader format, really, but in tournaments in general, if there was one particular change that you would like to see, that might improve this particular issue, is in terms of like the sportsmanship, but also just sort of player outreach in general. Because let's be honest here, a lot of players that aren't involved in the competitive scene tend to view competitive players as the elitist jerks of the hobby. What, in your opinion, would be the number one thing we could change as competitive players to make it seem more open, inviting, get people out and turning out for these events more?
It's a good question, and it's not one I'm sure that I have the answer to. There's unfortunately a lot of momentum kind of left over from the early days of competitive 40K that people that don't really know about tournaments, don't go to tournaments, that it kind of informs their opinion of what tournaments are and how they work. So I think stuff kind of like there's been a lot more kind of competitive oriented podcasts and blogs and stuff like that oriented at sort of bringing up the bottom, so to speak. Kind of elevating new players and sharing wisdom with them and stuff. And I think that's probably got to be the main way to approach it, is sort of just educating people about the game. The game is improved for everybody if everybody is a better player.
Right, and when you say a better player, you mean not just in terms of playing their armies better, but also just in general being more tactically and also more open-minded to different types of not only strategies, but different venues and such.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the more stuff that you're exposed to, the more situations that you've seen and been in, the better you can respond to them in an event, the better you're going to do, the further you're going to go. It's all practice.
Right. I do hope that this idea, this stigma around competitive events does sort of fade away, because I know at most of the GTs, in addition to the grand tournament, there's also tons of narrative events and other fun things going on that aren't nearly as competitively spirited, but are just as much fun, that a lot of players could get into, but generally tend to be less popular because they're intrinsically tied to a competitive event but aren't necessarily catering to the same type of player.
Yeah, like for instance, Nova has an event, a narrative event that's pretty big. It's always pretty big. Not as big as the GT, but it gets a lot of attendees, and it's a fun time. And that kind of has its own sort of competitiveness to it as well, because in every environment, people are pretty much always trying to do the best they can. Nobody shows up to lose.
Hmm. Of course. But um, I know in Nick Brown's blog article, he mentioned that every player going to a GT, and I think this extends to narrative events too, goes with a goal in mind. Obviously, if it's your first time attending a GT, expecting to win is a rather lofty goal, and he mentions that. But a lot of people, and this has been what I've done in the past too, particularly in 7th with my Dark Eldar, they go with an army list in mind, or the models they have, or with a theme in mind. They're like, I want to see how well I can do. What does the rest of the competitive meta do stacked up against this? And I think having the proper mindset going and having the proper expectations will get you a lot further. I think people go into competitive events, some go in pretty much setting themselves up for disappointment because they expect to do a lot better than they actually do without having put in the legwork required to win such an event.
Yeah, the mindset is really really key, even for an experienced player. I do think, like, if you're playing an army you kind of know is underpowered or whatever, you're playing it because you love it. You go into it with the mindset, like you said, of like, I'm going to see how well I can do with this. You're going to kind of prove a point, or just to sort of run an experiment. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people don't. For their first couple events, they don't really have a mindset like that, or much of any mindset at all. They just show up with their army, and then they maybe an unrealistic set of expectations about what the event is going to be like, because for usually somebody's first events, they don't have any clue what tournaments are like in general, so they're surprised by pretty much every aspect of it. That's where people tend to get a little bit salty.
It is a completely different scenario when you're used to playing against either fluffy lists or against people who generally don't have. They're not bringing out the heavy hitting lists. They might be playing something a little more thematic or fun for them on your casual 40k night. And then if those players who've only played against those types of lists go to a tournament and they see 7th edition, it was stuff like Wraith Guards and Raiders and stuff like that, Bark Stars and such. It's quite a shock because you've never been exposed to the rules being bent in ways they've never been meant to be bent. Let's be honest here. A lot of tournament lists only operate for about, in the way GW has been updating the rules, about 2 months.
I think I would disagree with that. I mean, let's define our terms. I don't want to use the word bent because that sounds adjacent to cheating. That's not really the case. But
it's not cheating. It is simply playing the rules as written, perhaps in spite of rules as intended.
I don't think that's an issue in 8th edition. That was certainly something in 7th. But in 8th, I think the rules are generally pretty straightforward. People pretty much get it. But to your point, it's people play to the full extent of the rules, whereas a lot of people playing at home don't they haven't thought all the consequences through of what the pile-in rules mean, or etc. And they have that they have their eyes opened for the first time. It can be sort of an unpleasant time.
Yes, in particular, one thing sticks out in my mind is falling back. But if you form a triangle around a particular model, then the unit cannot fall back because that model specifically cannot physically fall back through another unit. Yep.
It's a great, very important combat ability, and it catches a lot of newbies off guard, and it can be a source of feel bads.
Mm-hmm. It doesn't bother me with my razor wing flocks because they have fly. But nevertheless, that and for instance, the pile-in rule you mentioned that I believe, if memory serves, in my half-inebriated state, you simply have to go closer to the closest enemy model. It doesn't say directly towards.
Yeah, you have to end closer. So there's room for shenanigans, so to speak. Same thing with charging. You know, maybe somebody that's been playing 40K in their garage for a long time has a concept of charging that's outdated, or maybe it's just more kind of storyline driven, where they charge and they move all their models straight at the enemy. Well, they're going to get caught off guard the first time they go to a GT, and somebody charges their 40-man unit of cultists into a circle on the board or something bizarre like that to get access to objectives, or they charge they charge in a line, and they kind of rearrange their position like a marching band uh, to get board advantage. All perfectly legal, all very shocking to a new player or
Right.
an inexperienced tournament goer who may not have had a reason to think like that.
There is, and this is what is particular. This I've been saying this word a lot tonight, but this is one thing that has stuck out to me. Is normal 40k is very thematic in terms of, you're playing your army, you're playing along with how you think and how it's written in the book, how it's supposed to be going, sort of rolling along. Competitive 40k deals with it almost from a very logical standpoint of, it says I get to move these models as long as the unit ends closer to the enemy unit. Well, I can move a 10-man squad of Space Marines however I want, as long as at least one of those Space Marines is closer, so technically. And then if you follow that along, if you follow that trail of breadcrumbs along, you end up with competitive 40k, because really all it is, um, from my perspective anyway, is almost like a logic puzzle of, what can I get away with these rules? What is being said between the lines here that I can do that isn't explicitly said?
Yeah, yeah. How can I understand these rules for to get the most out of them, so I'm not handicapping myself, or to get an advantage out of it, and not in an abusive sense, but just in the sense of what do these rules actually mean?
And I think that a lot of this comes down to the skill of the general. Um, a lot of math hammer goes around. A lot of spreadsheets. I see way too many spreadsheets on forums that are worth their use, without taking into account the abilities of the person behind the wheel, so to speak, of the list. Two very good examples from my personal experience. The first time I went to a tournament in Northern Virginia, I brought my Dark Eldar, and this was after I had discovered the magic in 7th edition that was the Grotesquerie. And I did very well with it. I mean, I didn't win, obviously, but for a Dark Eldar army in 7th edition, in an era when Bark Stars and Chaos Demons with corrupting objectives and all that nonsense was going on, Decurions and such, I did pretty well. And the next year, I brought a almost copy-pasted Eldar net list. Scat Bikes, Warp Spiders, Wraith Knight, the whole gamut. And I lost just about every game I played. Even though the army was so much better, my generalship with Eldar was so much worse, because I didn't have as solid an understanding of the rules in your playstyle. And I think that detail, while subtle, is so very important when it comes to being a good player in Warhammer. Is you not only have to understand the rules, but you have to understand their application. You have to intrinsically know what a unit is capable of doing.
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to play to the best of your ability unless you know every detail about all of your units and what you can get out of them. And if you're just leaving not using every ability of a unit is just like leaving money on the table, basically.
Even if you're using every ability the unit has, if you're not,
Not using it in the most effective possible way, and so
yeah,
on. Yeah.
you refer to it as being able to see the matrix, and towards the end of 7th edition with Dark Eldar, I was able to see the matrix, and I think you kind of witnessed that firsthand during a dining room table demonstration when I brought out the parking lot list against your Death Guard, and it towards the end of 7th edition, I was able to get that army to do things that most players wouldn't believe the Dark Eldar army was capable of doing. And it wasn't because I was playing anything particularly crazy or off the walls. It was because I had played the army so much, so thoroughly, that I understood exactly what each unit was capable of doing simply by looking at the board. And I believe you are the same way with your chaos with your plague marines, and are still that way in 8th edition.
Yeah, I mean that's the single greatest advantage you could have in the game is experience with your chosen army and your chosen units, and just really just doing everything in your power to know your army. Just kind of it circles back to the first thing that we talked about with being prepared. It's about knowing your army, knowing what your army can do, and just playing that army in a lot of different situations. I know plenty of people that uh, they come up with a list and then they play it a couple times and they go, oh, this list sucks, and then they change and play something else. That is an awful, awful way to play the game. Um, because what they're doing is they hit a little bit of difficulty, they abandon the approach and they come up with something else. Well, they don't learn what did and didn't work about that list. And they didn't learn whether it's possible for that list to do better in a different situation, and maybe they just didn't see it yet.
Right.
They're not.
You should add an addendum on here. It's not a bad idea to abandon a bad list. If a list is bad, by all means, stop playing it. But understand specifically why that list was bad, and apply that to the new list's creation.
Right. Otherwise, you're just making changes willy nilly, and that's not helping you at all as a player. If you don't understand, why you're changing your list, what you don't like. And my recommendation is once you find a list that mostly works, play it and play it and play it and play it and play it until you find a situation where it doesn't work, and then play that situation over and over and over until you can win anyway, and then change it once you know what doesn't work.
See, my experience has been to play a list over and over, or at least when I write a list, I don't so much write a list as I have block components that I fit in there. A common block component in 8th edition, for instance, is a Black Heart Cabal, 3 Ravagers with an Archon, the Spearhead. That's in
Yeah.
almost every tournament list that I've seen. That includes Dark Eldar. That would be a block. In 7th edition, it was a Grotesquerie. Perhaps 2 Grotesqueries, that would be 2 blocks, because that's 2 formations of this thing. And I would shuffle those. I wouldn't view individual units. I would shuffle those blocks of units around because I knew intrinsically what those blocks did. And when you sort of segment it up in that way, you go from a codex that has like 20 or 30 different options and can get very confusing to a codex that really only has like 5 options that you're segmenting around, because obviously some of them are going to be underperforming to the point that they wouldn't function in a competitive list. And some are simply not going to be on the table for the kind of list that you're trying to run. So for any given competitive list, you're probably only going to be dealing with about 5 or so different blocks, subsets, either formations, detachments, something involving a few units sort of rotating around each other. Haywire Scourges might be one, or Shredder Scourges might be another. The Ravagers and Archon would be another. Perhaps a unit of Talos would be another for another person.
Right. Yeah, you figure out the pieces of your list, and you use them to cover each other's weaknesses. You use them to figure out how to win the mission. You take everything for a purpose.
Right,
You're not going to take everything, and you can't take everything, and some stuff maybe will never get play.
right, but figuring out the strengths and weaknesses of each of those, I wouldn't say units, but the blocks of units, or perhaps units, but they serve a particular purpose, such as Haywire Scourges, figuring out the particular uses of them.
Yeah.
Their strengths and weaknesses. So if you're making a list and you say, I need a little more long-range anti-tank, you reach for the Ravagers. You say, I need a little more close-range anti-infantry, you reach for the Shredder Scourges. Already knowing ahead of time how they function on the board, what their weaknesses are, what their strengths are, when they're going to be effective. You there, Sal?
Yep.
Okay. Well, Sal, I think we've covered a whole lot about GTs and RTTs and tournament culture in general, as well as the London GT. Some tips for list building, some tips for what to expect. Are there any parting words in the realm of grand tournaments in specific, but tournaments in general as well? Any parting words you'd like to give people who've maybe never gone to one of these, or in the past might have had a bad experience, but is having a fresh look at the tournament scene?
Uh, sure. Just keep an open mind and manage your expectations. It's a good time if you go into it with the right attitude.
I would agree with that. I would also say, if you're not personally a competitive person, most grand tournaments have plenty to offer that is not strictly competition. Like you said, Sal, no one goes into a tournament, even narrative games, expecting to lose, but it's worth looking into the other things that they might have to offer. Doubles tournaments, for instance, are great fun. We're expecting to play one in June. Is that correct?
Yeah, going to Liberty Hammer in Philadelphia. It's actually run by the same guys that run the Nova narrative event. It's a really great time. They've got some really cool missions, some gorgeous themed terrain boards. Maybe this year finally we're gonna get to play on that amazing frozen airfield board with all
Oh
those
yeah,
lights
that
and
one.
stuff.
I don't know. We got to play on the portal board, and that was pretty cool.
Yeah, for
You can
sure.
expect some pictures and a video about that coming up this June. But for now, Sal, I would like to thank you very much for coming on and giving your insight into this particular subject. I know a lot has been going around about it, and I think not only have we sort of added a bit of we cleared a bit of air, but also added a bit of sobriety to the subject of the London GT, and also discussing tournaments in general and managing the expectations and understanding what they exactly are. I think that's very useful information for people who've never really experienced one before. So thank you very much for coming on the channel.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to the next time.
All right, thank you very much. Goodbye.
See ya.